are all of those shapes inside the sand pits?
Yeah, so Rhys Jones, when he designed Lake of Isles, the Mashantucket Pequots, their spirit animals were the turtle and the fox. And so that is a sand bunker designed in the form of a turtle.
Oh, that's so cool.
And there's another one that's designed like a fox. So this is down in Connecticut. Anything that would help the tribes, I'm happy to do, Rhys Jones said. His brother, RTJ2, also talked about how they didn't work for free, but when RTJ2 designed Cochiti, which was 1981, which is pretty early in this history, he worked for, not a lot of money. And he has a really great story about how when he went for the interview, they smoked a peace pipe, and the council got together to see if his spirit was right to design their course. And that was his interview, smoking a peace pipe with the elders of the tribe. The historian Lori Potter from Mashantucket Pequots also features in the article, the essay in the book, and she said, we are a people of precedent, the first Indian reservation, the first tribal casino, and the first tribal gaming commission, and that would have venerated in October 1988. That's when Ronald Reagan, credit where credit is due, Ronald Reagan is the one who approved the Gaming Act that Congress had passed. And so in 1988, that's kind of the watershed moment when they did have bingo halls and some card tables before that, but that was the moment when the tribes could get into gaming full time. There are issues, right? And the tribes are aware of this. So I would ask them, was there any opposition to going into gaming? And they say, yeah. They'd say, we voted on it, right? There were people that were against it for those issues of, addiction and ethical issues. But in each case, they said, the ones I talked to said, we voted on it and we voted for gaming. And that's what started the revenues that enabled not only golf courses, museums, archives, schools. There's movement now to reinstate a lot of the languages. Yeah. All that's because of gaming, right? All of that is because of the revenues of gaming. They're trying to retake their history. Are there any Native players, right? Were there any Native players in history? Well, I come on this fellow named Oscar Smith Bunn. And here's his advertisement in Golf Magazine. This was in early 1900s. A professional golfer, many years experience, excellent references, desires an engagement for winter. Please address Oscar Bunn, Shinnecock Indian Reservation, Southampton, Long Island, New York. So Oscar Bunn was where it all began. I'm going to talk more about him at the end. But he played in the second and fifth U.S. Opens, 1896 and 1899. He was a gifted club maker, teacher, and golfer. And he was a marquee name. He was, you can find stuff about him in the New York Times, the Brooklyn Eagle. He taught in Lake Placid. He set course records in New York, Connecticut, and Florida. And he went with Mungo Park, who's a big name in early golf, to design a course in Argentina. So Oscar Bunn, he was a classy dresser. He was tall and lithe, and obviously a gifted player and teacher. And he lived on the res. He would play in a fedora and a vest, and that's a picture from when he played in the 1899 U.S. Open, which was in Baltimore. And there's a really interesting story here. Shinnecock Hills is considered the finest golf course in the world by everyone. Everyone says it's the best. They call it sublime. They call it as if God laid it out. And, that's land that the white tribe bought from the Shinnecocks for a pittance, and there's been lawsuits and whatnot going back and forth. But Theodore Havemeyer was the man who cornered the sugar market, Domino's Sugar, right? And he was one of the ones who founded the USGA in 1895, and he also helped build Shinnecock Hills. And in 1896, Shinnecock Hills now, if I show up there, they would take me for kitchen help and show me to the back door, right? If you don't have a name and you don't have a lot of money, Shinnecock Hills is not your club, right? And I don't even know. I think the initiation fee is in the hundreds of thousands of dollars and probably $40,000 or $50,000 a year. It is as white as it can get, right? But in the second U.S. Open, ironically enough, 1896, Shinnecock Hills was represented by a native, Oscar Bunn, who could be considered the first American-born golf pro, and his friend was John Shippen, who was a black man. John Shippen was on the reservation because his father was a preacher. So there you are, 1896, the USGA is 2 years old, and Shinnecock Hills runs out black man and a native man to represent them. And when the British and Scottish came, they would come to win the U.S. Open, right? They didn't believe Americans had golfers. They were going to refuse to play. They said, we're not going to play if you're going to run out, colored guys. And Havemeyer famously said, well, if you're not going to play, they're going to go out and play by themselves, and they'll be 1 and 2. And he stood them down. He said, if you don't pick up your irons, I'm going to run them out by themselves. And it's kind of a shining moment. The USGA is very different than the PGA. I'll make that distinction later as well. The USGA runs 24 opens each year. They now have an adaptive open for disabled golfers. They are a much more progressive organization than the PGA. I'll get back to that. But anyway, it's a moment that I record. It's really where the book begins. Havemeyer standing down the Brits and the Scots. John Shippen, interestingly enough, almost won that U.S. Open. And famously, this is before sand wedges. Sand wedges come much later. Shippen hit into a sandy road, and he got an 11 on a hole on the last day. Otherwise, he would have won. So if he'd had a sand wedge, John Shippen would have been the first American to win. He came in fifth. Oscar Bunn came in, I think, 20th. Harry Vardon was the great British golfer. He won 6 British Opens. He won something like 49 tournaments. He did win the U.S. Open in 1900. He came over, and from March to October in 1900, he went around the country. He went all over. Ohio, Colorado. He was sponsored by Spalding, and he was selling the Barton Flyer golf ball. And he would play the local pro for $500 and a bottle of scotch. I think that's what I have in the book. I think it was more like $250 and maybe some scotch. Barton comes over, and that begins the golf boom in America. They call it the Barton invasion. Now, just to illustrate the place of Oscar Bunn in this history, he played Barton twice on that tour. The New York Times covered the incident in which he lost to Barton. Barton claims he only lost 2 matches in that whole time. He also won the U.S. Open in October. But here he is at Lake Placid, New York, and he plays Oscar Bunn. Now, what I uncovered was an article in the Lake Placid Times called the Argus. Oscar Bunn won the second match. And I recount that in my book as a kind of historical fiction. I imagine that match. And at that time, Oscar Bunn is being mentored by Seymour Dunn, the great Scot, who came over with his Uncle Willie. The Dunns were very big in bringing the gospel of golf, I call it. Barton began the boom, and from 1900 to the Depression, in October 29, thousands of golf courses were made across the country. Now, this is kind of interesting. I've become quite friendly with Oscar Bunn's family, and they said there were only 2 known pictures of Oscar when I began my research. The one in Baltimore I found, they didn't know about that one. I think this is a 19-year-old Oscar Bunn. There's Harry Barton teeing off. This is at Eagle's Nest in the Adirondacks. I believe that's Oscar Bunn. Notice the fedora. He would have been 19 at that time. And we isolated that image there. And now, just to be clear, Oscar's family doesn't think that's him. They think it's too small, but he's standing below the tee. That's why he looks small. He was 5'10". He's about 5'10" or maybe 5'11". That's the Barton invasion, and Oscar's part in it. He was one of only 2 people to beat Barton in that whole time. Barton went home a very wealthy man, by the way. There was no income tax at that time, and he played constantly all around the country on a railroad tour, and went home with just short of $10,000, which at that time was a very large sum. This is a really fascinating moment. In October, Columbus Day weekend, deliberately chosen, in 1911, is the first National Society of American Indians meeting. And they held it at Ohio State, Columbus Day weekend, 1911, and it was led by a woman, Laura Cornelius Kellogg. She was a very she was a firebrand, right? She was a very outspoken advocate for Native rights. She was Oneida. And there's one of her quotes. She says, "I'm not the new Indian, I'm the old Indian adjusted to new conditions." She spoke at the UN. She spoke to the U.S. Congress. She published in her lifetime. And this is kind of the argument of the book in many respects, is that the one thing she said at that first conference is, we need economy on our own land. We need economy on our own land. And at that time, I mean, we're all educated people. We know that the Native tribes were decimated at this time. I mean, it was. I mean, you know, we focus on Jim Crow, right? It was worse for the Natives, right? Through the teens and the 20s and whatnot. And I'll talk about that more of that later. But this was the first conference led by Red Cloud and Laura Cornelius Kellogg, and they began to advocate for trying to recover their culture, right? And she spoke very eloquently about that. She wrote poetry. She wrote books about how Natives were going to recover and how to create economy. Now, interestingly enough, she's Oneida, and she managed to get a reservation for the Oneida outside Green Bay, Wisconsin. And it's now one of the largest reservations in the country. And there, interestingly enough, is Thornberry, which is the home course of the Green Bay Packers. It's a Native-owned course, and they have a relationship with the LPGA. The LPGA now plays at Thornberry. So I don't know if she were alive, whether she'd agree with my argument in the book that golf is one way Natives are creating economy on their land. But I think she might be impressed that Thornberry is one of the real success stories, and I'll show you a picture of it in a bit. A fellow by the name of Tom Bendelow, a Scottish architect, builds Mound Builders Golf Course on a huge earthwork of the Hopewell culture. And this is, the New York Times has been following this, and there's been recent developments since I wrote the book. But Bendelow built on this large earthen structure that was charting the cycles of the moon, built by the Hopewell culture, which is the culture that was before the tribes really evolved. So when you go back to, prehistory, pre-Columbian times, well, even older than that, the culture in the Midwest and the plains was called the Hopewell culture. And that was before you had the Potawatomi and the Sioux and the Lakota. It's really, I don't want to say prehistoric, that's the wrong word, but they were mound builders. All throughout the Midwest, all up and down the Mississippi Valley, they were building earth structures. And this one was aligned with the cycle of the moon. And so there's some Ohio State scholars, Ray Hively, and another who have documented it. And I interviewed John Blow, who's a Native historian. And it's bigger than the pyramids. It's bigger than Taj Mahal. It was named in September of last year a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Oh. Now, interestingly enough, ironically enough, mound builders preserved. Now, all around mound builders, you have like corporate decimation. You have like McDonald's and Dunkin' Donuts. So, oddly enough, Bendelow's desecration of the mounds and the structure actually helped to preserve it. Right? Now, there is another site nearby called the Great Circle, and that was preserved because it was a fair. It was a county fair site. So these two sites are now UNESCO World Heritage Sites, just named. And John Lowe famously says in my book that I said, well, why didn't you build like a pyramid? He's like, this is as important as the pyramids. This is as important as Taj Mahal. And he says, we wanted to hug the earth. We wanted to hug our grandmother. It's really beautiful. So anyway, interestingly enough, the golf course has been sued repeatedly to give up the course and restore the mounds, and they just agreed to that. It's been a decades-long struggle. But the Ohio History Project has sued repeatedly, and they finally agreed on a price for the golf course to move. So they're going to restore the lunar mound world. It's earthen structures, so it aligns with the lunar solstice, right? So when the moon hits the solstice and the equinox and all that stuff, it aligns with the mound structures in here. And John Lowe has written about it, and he's the director of the sites. You could look him up, or I have more in my book, but it was they wanted to, he talks about it quite eloquently. Like he says that the tribe wanted to commune with the spirits of the universe, right? And they wanted to be in touch with whatever powers was moving the moon and driving that energy, right? They want to make this a site that people can visit and see and honor the work of the tribes from an earlier time. There is a site nearby which I walked called the Great Circle, and it's astounding. I mean, it's just like, wow. It's a great mound circle that's the size of Southbridge, right? And it got turned into a county fair site. This was preserved by Mound Builders golf course, and that's going to be removed, and they're going to restore the mounds here. It's closely related with the Great Circle. They're nearby. So the Ohio History Project are not natives. There are no recognized tribes in Ohio, and so the tribes are being represented by a group called the Ohio History Project. They're the ones who've sued and won now for the return of the mounds.
If they built this quote-unquote prehistory, then what's the culture that they're trying to...
It's called the Hopewell culture.
And how do they know what this Hopewell culture is if it's prehistory, quote unquote?
Well, by this kind of work, right? By the archaeology of their structures and whatnot, right? Because they did not have a written culture. And it's even before, as far as I can tell, the Hopewell culture is the term for the whole Mississippian Plains culture that was there well before Columbus and well before those tribes split into the tribes we know of today. That we know from oral history, right? So the Hopewell culture is known as the term for the culture that existed and built these mounds from 2,000 years ago to maybe 10,000 years ago. This is the Green Bay Packers course, Thornberry. LPGA goes there. That's on the reservation that Laura Cornelius Kellogg established. And they continue to grow through fee to trust programs and land back movements. The reservations are getting more and more land. Circling Raven, these are places I want to go. I did go to Cochiti. That's the Robert Trent Jones Jr., and that's one of the first, 1981. Robert Trent Jones went, smoked the peace pipe, and designed Cochiti, which I visited last October. And that was before the gaming law. So they got into it simply to try and create golf revenue from tourism, right? These others are related to casinos, and they're meant to bring in golfers and gamblers. And when I was at the USGA recently, USGA has been very supportive of my work. I was at the USGA just about 10 days ago, and a guy in the audience said, "Oh, I went to Dancing Rabbit." And he said it was absolutely magnificent. Eagle Falls is in California. Circling Raven hosts the LPGA and the Epson Tour. So these are ways to bring in gamblers, to bring in golfers, to bring in tourism, and now to create partnerships with some of the... I mean, golf is a big industry, right? Pinehurst, the woman that the USGA said generates nearly $1 billion in tourism money each year. $800 million in tourism each year. And that's from golf and tennis and whatnot. Yeah.
Are there public and private, or are they public courses?
These are all public.
Oh.
That's kind of interesting too. Shinnecock is not, but the Shinnecock is not native owned. But the native owned courses are public, yeah. They want you to come in and play and spend your money. But the industry is huge. I mean, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, golf, right? And so I think Laura Cornelius Kellogg might smile down from having to say, well, it's a good thing the natives are trying to get a piece of that, right? And they're doing. I make a note in the book that golf is the game that requires the most amount of land to play, right? And, so you need 240 acres to have an 18-hole course. And so there's an element to that, too, to the natives and the land and shepherding the land and whatnot. There are issues with pollution and pesticides and all that. I don't want to get into that necessarily, but my retort to that, though, is imagine those 240 acres with 50 houses, with the city on it, or houses. That would be a far worse situation. Right? The first 100 years of the hardest. He was recognized fairly recently as the longest-serving golf instructor in history. He taught for 63 years on Mackinac Island in Michigan. at a course called Wawashkamo. And this is in the book. I'll give myself a plug here, is that my essay on Dufina won the Coin Prize this year, so won a national prize. That essay is called Where It's Never Not Beautiful, which is an Indian translation of the name of Mackinac Island, Where It's Never Not Beautiful. And it is the spiritual center of their tribe, Mackinac Island. And every year, the women of the tribes from the Chippewa and the Ottawa and the Anishinaabe and the Potawatomi take the young women there, and they have a conference on womanhood on that island because it is their spiritual center. And Dufina, he knew it was his destiny. When he was 10 years old, 9 and 10 years old, a doctor from Chicago brought in Alex Smith, a Scotsman, to build a course called Wawashkamo. Dufina was watching it being built, and he realized, this is my life. And he stayed there teaching golf for 63 years before he retired. It's really a magnificent story. And an interesting thing, I do get into some politics. I don't shy away. He was also a very good golfer, and he won the Western Open one year, which was held nearby. He didn't like to go far from the island, but it was nearby, I think in Detroit, and he won it. And the Detroit Free Press had a headline that said, "Red Man Can Golf." Now, this is 1923. He had 3 daughters. It was the age of Indian removal, and he was worried for his daughters, that they would remove his daughters. And so he went down and demanded that the Free Press run an article that said, "Full-blooded French Canadian wins Western Open," so that they wouldn't think he was native, that they would think he was French Canadian, because he was worried that they would take away his 3 daughters. It's a really rich history. It's really fascinating stuff. I really feel blessed. I have Monica's support. I really feel lucky to have told it. And the way it fell into place, I was saying to Margaret earlier, there's something of the Great Spirit was watching this project. I have to say, I really feel like I was meant to do it. And the way the stories came, and the people who helped. Like, there's a Northern Michigan native historian who teaches at the university, really helped with the Dufina article. There was a retired director of State Park, Phil Porter, who had done a lot of research into Dufina, and these guys were just so helpful. They want the story out there, and it is. Now it's out there, and I feel really lucky and blessed. So in 1912, Jim Thorpe wins the decathlon and the pentathlon in the Olympics, even though someone stole his racing shoes, by the way. He comes back, and he's a gifted athlete. The first time he played golf, he shot a 76, his family told me. I'm in touch with some of his family. I mean, that's just astounding. That's unheard of, right? He then became a baseball player, and he took some lunch money from the manager. He was playing in the minor leagues, and the manager, I think it was the assistant manager, wintered in Southbridge. Isn't that right? Like, he lived like right around the corner, and he called the Telegram and Gazette and said, "Thorpe is not an amateur, he's taking money." And the Telegram, this is, I should know the year, but the Telegram broke that story, and the Olympic Committee took his medals away, rescinded his medals. And again, this really gets into interesting stuff, because I don't know, I put it this way, it's like the natives don't naturally, because of their history, wouldn't naturally say, "What do you mean? These are my medals, screw up," right? But he didn't. He gave up the medals, and he began a life of hardship, really hardship. He was down on his luck at this time. He was good friends with Bob Hope and Bing Crosby through golf, and they were lending him money. He would borrow $100 or $500 from Bob Hope just to live, just to survive. And he was helping them cast the Indian spaghetti westerns and whatnot in Hollywood. He would do voiceovers, and he was trying to make a living in Hollywood. They eventually made a movie about Thorpe with Burt Lancaster, but that he got no money from that either. He became quite desperate. It's really kind of sad. Of course, they now have reinstated the medals, right, after posthumously. I'm in touch with his family. They're in Oklahoma. One of them is a very good golfer named Robert Komachi, who played in the Native American Open last year. And Jimmy Jimmy Squire. I'm going to talk a little bit about Jimmy Squire, but Thorpe was part of the Thunder Clan of the Sac and Fox. It's all really fascinating stuff, and it does relate to Southbridge, whoever that rat was. It really is sad, though, because if you read the biography of Thorpe, it got bad. It was like a roadshow.
How long did it take for them to reinstate the medals?
I think they didn't do it until the 1960s.
Oh, gee.
Yeah. And, in his the biographer, who I quote, says, the unending hustle for a living is what his life became. Unending hustle for a living. He was going to try and teach golf, and he went to Florida at one point in a trailer with, I think, his fourth wife, and it never got off the ground. This is Althea Gibson, first woman of color to win Wimbledon twice. She twice lifted the Rosewater Trophy presented by the Queen of England, and she became a professional golfer as well. And this gentleman here, that is Joe Louis, the great boxer and the great golfer. She was black Cherokee, Lumbee from North Carolina. He was white, black, and Cherokee from Alabama. This is a quote from Joe Louis. We come from some blacks, some whites, some very big Indians. Put all that together and you got something. Teeing it up in front of him is his son, Joe Louis Barrow Jr. And I interview him in the book, and it's absolutely fascinating, I have to say. He got to play with Althea Gibson. He talks about that. And that gentleman behind him is Ted Rhodes, one of the great Negro golfers of the United Golf Association, which they founded when the PGA had their Caucasian-only rule. From 1916 to 1961, the PGA had a Caucasian-only rule. And so black Africans and black Americans founded their own league called the United Golf Association. In fact, Massachusetts played a key role in that. Mapledale, which is now Stowe, number 2, was a black-owned course, and they held the UGA Open, which was open to everybody, not just blacks, by the way. Althea Gibson was raised in Harlem. She was born in North Carolina, raised on the streets of Harlem. Hard scrabble life. Left tennis and joined the LPGA. She was the first woman of color to be on the LPGA. And she never won. She came in second once. But she opened the door for Renee Powell and some of the great Native and black female golfers to follow. Now, Joe Louis, this was a real education for me in my research. Joe Louis was like the Taylor Swift of his time. He was enormously popular from his boxing, right? And, if you remember the story of them defeating Max Schnelling, he represented America at the time that Nazism had happened. And the German boxer Schnelling comes over, and everyone associated him with Hitler. And in fact, FDR called Joe Louis into his office and said, "You have to beat this guy." And he did. In fact, it's really, I can't say it enough, but it's a fascinating moment where Joe Louis, it was in Yankee Stadium, and Joe Louis was so fast and furious that Schnelling turned away just to try and survive the onslaught. The fight lasted 1 minute and 46 seconds, and Louis had cracked his back and ribs. And Schnelling, because he was so hurt, accused Louis of a low blow, but it was not. And he later apologized for that because he was simply trying to survive and run away from Joe Louis. But from his boxing, Louis became enormously popular, and then in World War II gave exhibitions for the soldiers. Now, he had a friend from Chicago named Truman Gibson, who was a secretary of the Army. He was a friend of Louis's, and when Louis would give his exhibitions, he'd say, "Why are the black guys in the back?" Right? The Army was segregated. And he said that again and again to, he was a rock star at this time. He said that again and again to Truman Gibson, and Gibson went to Truman, Harry Truman, and said, "Joe Louis is complaining that the blacks are segregated," and Truman's the one who integrated the Army, right? 1949. 1952, Joe Louis, at the height of his popularity, is a great golfer as well. He's still boxing. He's a media star. He's got, he's selling milk, he's selling bread, and he qualifies for the San Diego Open in 1952, and Chevrolet says, "We're going to sponsor Joe Louis to play in this PGA event."
And Horton Smith, who was the head of the PGA at that time, calls him up and says, "You can't play because you're black." And Joe Louis says, "You're going to have to tell me that to my face." And he flies. So imagine, the champion of the world telling you you're going to have to tell him to his face. So he flies to San Diego and for a meeting with Horton Smith the day before the San Diego Open. And his friend Ted Rhodes is there, along with Charlie Sifford and Bill Spiller. Charlie Sifford's the man that Tiger Woods named his son after. And they're great black golfers, and they want a chance to play the best, right? So Horton Smith opens the door and he says, "Okay, Joe, you can come in. Your friends have to wait outside." And he closes the door. Now, Bill Spiller was known to be a kind of a bugging out type of character. He carried a gun, right? Because, he carried a gun. We know some people carry guns. Anyway, they wait outside, and Horton Smith calls Joe Louis and he says, "You can play because you're an amateur. Your friends can't play because they're professionals," right? So Joe Louis goes outside to his friends and he says, "You guys can't play. I'm going to play to break the barrier, but you can't play because you're pros." Bill Spiller never talked to him again, walked away and said, "No, you're not going to do that, right?" And Joe Louis said, "Yeah, we have to do this inch by inch." So they never talked again, but there's a nice epilogue to that where the Sons made up. When the PGA finally recognized Bill Spiller, the Sons made up and said, "There's no more bad blood." The next day, Horton Smith says, "I'm going to play with Joe Louis." And they go out, and there's like a smattering of people following the white golfers. There were throngs following Joe Louis. Women were baring their breasts. The men were out there with want to bring him tea and coffee, and he was just an enormous star. And Horton Smith realizes, I can't hold the floodwaters back on this. It was like literally fairways lined with people cheering on Joe Louis. And so his friends did get to play the very next weekend in the Phoenix Open. Charlie Sifford, Bill Spiller, Ted Rhodes, and others. And that's when the barrier was broken, 1952, because of Joe Louis. His son says in the book, I love this line, he says, "My father had an enormous desire to help people." Really, really moving. And he helped his sisters through Howard University. And what's interesting here, I know I'm going to run short of time, but this is a point that I make in the book. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it if I can, is that Louis and Gibson, they didn't have organizational support, right? They didn't have Nike. They didn't have the USTA backing them. They didn't have the organizations like NB3 that support Native youth today. They recovered with drugs and alcohol, right? Joe Louis liked cocaine. And after his bouts, he would go to the Archway in Chicago and drink. And his friends would bring him cocaine. And that's how he recovered from his fights and from the pain and challenge of being Joe Louis. Althea Gibson, the same, heavy drinker, because they were alone. They were at the height of the world.
Even managers, they didn't have.
They didn't have managers, no.
All those deals should have been handled by managers.
Yeah.
Today.
No, they had. They were a lot of times surrounded by. I want to watch my language, but unprofessionals, right? They'd be surrounded by people that are just feeding off their fame and money, right?
So why was he considered an amateur if he had Chevrolet sponsoring him?
He was an amateur in golf. That's what Horton Smith had said. He tried to kind of, cut the split hairs there. He said, "You're an amateur in golf." His friends were playing professionally. Bill Spiller, Charlie Sifford. Now, Bill Spiller and Ted Rhodes were too old to win. It's kind of a sad story on the PGA, but Charlie Sifford did win, I think twice, on the PGA into the 1960s. But even after that moment, 1952, it took 9 years before the PGA finally voted down the Caucasian-only rule. So yeah, it's just fascinating stuff. And again, like the Great Spirit was watching, because I found a number and it says Joe Louis Barrow Jr. And I called it, and Joe Louis's son picks up. He's 76. He lives in Jacksonville, Florida, and he goes, "I never answer this phone." He goes, "I just happened to be. It was a landline." He goes, "I just happened to be walking by. Who is this?" And I got to interview him like over a course of 3 days. You can hardly call us wealthy, but before the advent of gaming, you certainly could call us destitute. Now we're just in a position where we feel like maybe we've got a chance. Interestingly enough, 7 generations on from Oscar Bunn. And you have this new culture of golfers among natives. And in part because of these high-end access to courses, as Tony just brought up, access to gear. There's a native at Nike named Sam McCracken, who is from Fort Peck Reservation. He's raised millions and millions of dollars for young Native athletes. It's called the N7 Fund. I interviewed him. I'm really hoping he gets behind the book. He's a big shot.
Can you explain the N7, because I never knew what that was?
Nike 7. So you know that
The 7 generations.
I think it was Chief Seattle who said we should live as if our actions would not harm 7 generations, right? So it's kind of a spiritual way of life for natives. I think that's right. I think it was Chief Seattle who said that. So N7 is referencing that. And Sam McCracken started the N7 Fund. And he's very good friends with this gentleman here. That's Notah Begay III. Notah Begay III. He was Tiger Woods' roommate at Stanford. They won 2 NCAA championships together, and he won 4 times on the PGA Tour before he hurt his back. He also ran into a problem with alcohol, which I can talk about later. That's Madison Long, who I feature. And Madison just got a D1 scholarship to play golf at the University of Maryland. So she's a protege. He thinks that his back injury was a blessing, right, from the Great Spirit, because it allowed him to found the NB3 Foundation, which is supporting Native youth. And that is at Santa Ana, where they hold the Native American Open each year. That's one of his proteges who I interview. And interestingly enough, you talk about Gibson, being raised on the streets of Harlem and her father boxing with her, and Joe Louis, he left Alabama. I don't know if he knew his parents. But when I got to these there's a young Chickasaw golfer named Peyton Beans Factor. I interviewed their parents. So you had coaches, parents. These are things that many of us took for granted. This is not the case. D1 scholarship to play golf. I don't know if that's a first or not, but it certainly is unusual for a native culture to produce this. This is Jason Montoya, who I took a lesson from. It didn't help. He's the first Pueblo native to become a PGA professional. He's from the Pueblo that Deb Havlin is from. That's him teaching. I think that is Madison. That's Gabby Lemieux. She is on the LPGA right now. She's from Idaho. And that over there is Jimmy Squire. And I'll say a little bit about Jimmy, but Jimmy is from Oklahoma and was an early life amputee. He lost his right leg. You want to talk about hardscrabble life? I mean, I'm not even going to go into it other than to say Jimmy is indefatigable. If there's anyone that defines that word. 22 years ago, he started encouraging amputees, veterans and native amputees, to play golf and to get involved, because amputeeism is very high in the native community because of diabetes and poor health care. And also, natives sign up for the Army and the armed services at a higher rate to escape the reservation. There's a lot of stories of that in the book. And so he goes around to tournaments, playing and trying to encourage natives and veteran amputees to get out there. He now calls Monica and I auntie and uncle because we help him out a little bit to sign up for some tournaments and stuff. And I've been talking to him today because he's playing in a tournament tomorrow. And he's got a meeting with John Daly this week at a tournament. And so I sent a book out signed to John Daly that Jimmy's going to present. It's just been a really interesting journey the last 2 years doing this research. I feel very blessed to have support of people like Director Morrissey and Monica and my golfing friends and neighbors to put this together. It really, I have to say, buy the book. It's interesting. And it's not just about golf. It's about much more than that. It's about land back initiatives. It's about Native recovery, which is ongoing and necessary, right? I'll finish here. This is David Bunn Martine. That's the great-grandnephew of Oscar Bunn. He's an artist. He studied with Rauschenberg. He studied with Charles Peale out in Oklahoma. And that's Mike Smith, whose family helped build Shinnecock Hills and is now still the greenskeepers there. His son is the head greenskeepers. So I went back down because I said to David, this goes back about a year, I said, shouldn't the Hall of Fame have a picture of Oscar Bunn? We need to get Oscar Bunn into the books, right? And he said it would be $9,000 plus shipping and framing. And I was like, oh, I don't have that. But let's call the USGA. They were aware of the project, and I put together a call with Rosemary Maravets and Victoria Neno, and they didn't even flinch when we said $9,000. They were like, of course we'll do that. And sure enough, so David spent about 6 months. Here's the portrait. It's finished. It's in the World Golf Hall of Fame. It was there for my talk last Thursday. And I was really stunned to see it. I didn't think it was going to be there. And I walked in, they had it up there. And so I went down to see it when he finished, and then he shipped it it's now down in Pinehurst at the World Golf Hall of Fame. So, maybe a little progress along the way. But I have to say, when I went back to Shinnecock, and I was like, well, if I went to the club, that club is very exclusive. They'd take me for the kitchen help and show me the back door, right? Deliveries are out back, right? So I went out for a walk just by myself. I slipped through some gates and walked the course just to see it. Tony and Nancy can verify this. I'm really good at finding golf balls. I found one that was monogrammed, like a brand new Titleist Pro V that had like somebody's initials on it. And I'm like, oh. And then I see this little speck underneath a bush. And I'm like, that's a golf ball. And I'm like, I want to know about that golf ball. And I started digging. This is on the side of the Shinnecock Hills, I think hole number 4 or something like that. And I dig up Sweet Shot, a ball from the 1940s. And I literally had to dig. I had to kick with my heel, and I had farmer fingernails from it. I dug it up, and I'm like, all right, that's Oscar Bunn's nickname right there, Oscar Sweet Shot Bunn. And that's where and so actually on this day, I'm out of time, but on this day, Mike and I went to his burial site. And that's where I said, I'm going to end this journey there. We went to where Oscar was buried, and then I went over and dug up Sweet Shot. And I was like, yeah, he's kind of the guiding spirit of this project in many respects. And as I said in one of the last lines in the book is, let him walk among the unforgotten, right? Why are we forgetting this history?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.